All right, 97.7 Outlaw Radio FM listeners, right here, we actually have a phenomenal author, New York Times bestseller. He's a professor. He is honestly the jack of all trades. We got AJ Hartley right here, right now. How are you doing this evening?
I'm good, man. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Best I can possibly be, man. I got to say, huge fan of your work. You know, you do so many phenomenal things just for book authors all around, man. Like your stories are absolutely phenomenal. So thank you so much for just a bit of your time here this evening.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
But I know you're a busy guy, so I'm gonna dive right into these things. But I have to ask, man, taking you back from the beginning, because like I mentioned, you're a phenomenal author. You've written so many amazing stories. What got you actually into writing books originally?
I mean, I've always been a storyteller. I grew up in a sort of working class industrial town in northern England, and sometimes it could be a bit bleak, you know, and books were sort of my little escape from the world, and I always wanted to write. I started writing like seriously when I was like 19, but in those days, which was before people sort of self-published and before a lot of small presses and things, you either got an agent and a big deal with a major house, or you got nothing. So I wrote for like 20 years before my first book came out. So, and I've been doing it ever since. So, that was 20 years ago. So.
When you actually first wrote your first story, did you actually ever include any of those like scripts actually in any of your actual books, or did you kind of keep those very early on writings, just kind of for your own personal use?
Yeah, I know. Just for my own use, I was just, I mean, I was a kid who liked to literally tell stories, to just speaking, ghost stories and stuff like that, so, but yeah, none of them were sort of publishable kind of quality. It was just, kid stuff. But over the years, I mean, I would, as I wrote stuff, especially if I thought it was okay, even if I hadn't found a publisher, I would put it aside and maybe come back to it again in the future and rethink it and rewrite. I mean, I just published this year, I published a book that I'd been working on for like 20 years, a novel, Burning Shakespeare, which has been sort of a lot of different things, but literally I'd been working on it for 20 years. And I don't mean it took me 20 years to write it. I mean, I wrote it and then I rewrote it and I rewrote it and yeah.
Like they say, AJ, everyone is their own worst critic. You know what I mean? Like as long as it's good on your end, that's all that matters, though.
I guess though, it's always nice to actually find readers, so that's the hurdle.
And also, aside from actually being an author for a moment, you are actually currently the Robinson Professor of Shakespeare Studies at the University of North Carolina. I was wondering if you can actually just tell us a bit more about that venture, and of course, what actually got you into being a professor?
um I lived in Japan right out of my undergraduate degree. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I went to Japan for a couple of years, and I met my wife there. She's now my wife. Obviously, she wasn't then, and she's an American. And I wanted a way to come to the States for a while. So I decided to go to graduate school. It wasn't really a career choice. It was just like something to do. And I liked reading books, as we've already said. So it was a way to come to the US and spend some time here. And, you get into the master's program and then everybody's competing to get into the PhD. So you do that. And suddenly you realize you've made a career choice, sort of without noticing, and, when I was a student, I grew up around theater. So, I'd always been interested in performed drama. And when I was studying Shakespeare, both as an undergrad and a graduate student, I particularly got excited about seeing this stuff on stage. And I started, working in theater myself, directing and dramaturging and things like that. So that's part of what my position is now. As I say, my doctorate was in English, but most of my interests as far as Shakespeare were concerned pushed me towards the performance side, whether that's performance history or theory or practically staging stuff, so that's kind of what I do. So I'm actually in a theater department. I have some teaching obligations in English, but my tenure home, so to speak, at UNCC is in theater. Yeah.
And I also read in 2001 that you actually won Professor of the Year as well. It must have been such a surreal experience to actually just accept that award, especially looking back with it being over 20 years now.
Well, to be honest, I'd forgotten that happened. So, I mean, that's the nature of the business, isn't it? It's like awards and all that sort of stuff. It's great at the time, and then you move on to the next thing. And it's why I think writers are sort of never satisfied, because the goalposts are always moving. At least the goalposts of your own success are always moving. First you just want to get a book out, and then you get the book out, and then you want to, I don't know, hit a bestseller list, or get a bunch of foreign translations, or get a movie or a TV show, whatever, So there's always something to shoot for that you haven't got yet. So yeah, I kind of forget about things that happened a long time ago and just keep moving. You're like the shark. You got to keep swimming, otherwise you drown.
Especially in the entertainment industry as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah, really.
But also, going back a few moments ago when you said you actually lived in Japan, of course you're originally from the UK. Like, what was it like actually like moving all the way across to Japan? Like, what was the lifestyle like? Was it a complete drastic change? Because some people say Japan is so advanced technology wise.
It is and it isn't. I mean, it's funny, that there was a lot of stuff that was streets ahead of anything that I'd seen before, but also Japan is a very traditional society, and that sometimes affects the way that they use technology. I mean, I was always amazed at people using, computers and word processors that were like 10 years behind. But it was what everybody used. And I mean, and still to this day in Japan, it's still a very cash-driven economy. I mean, people carrying money around, that there's not a lot of credit card use and stuff like that. Although, not when I've been most recently. But in terms of what it was like going over there, it was. I mean, it was fantastic. I had a great experience. I was there a couple of years, but it was also pretty traumatizing is not the word, but it was a hard shift, 'cause I was there in the 80s, late 80s. So there's no internet. No, I mean, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have, so I mean, I left, where I had spent the vast majority of my life, and didn't speak to anybody from there, except, I'd call my family like once a month because that was all I could afford. And the rest of the time I was, on my own. I remember being picked up in Tokyo after we had some sort of orientation thing, and the teacher took me to the school where I was going to work, and he's like, "This is where you're going to be. This is where your office is. This is where your apartment is. This is how you work the bath. School starts in 6 weeks. Bye." And I was like, "What?" you know, and I didn't at the time. I didn't speak the language. And there would be times when days, maybe even weeks would go by without me having a real conversation with anybody. And I'd walk around the supermarket, and like I couldn't even recognize what was food. What I was like, the hell is that? I don't know. So yeah, it was a fairly sort of steep learning curve, but in the end, it was fantastic, and I go back there as much as I can.
And obviously, during your stay there, did you ever actually run into anybody that did indeed, sorry, speak English, or is it all just Japanese?
Yeah, oh, of course. But, I mean, I lived in a relatively small town, a couple of hours outside Tokyo, and the vast majority of people didn't, even though they studied English in school, but they don't speak English. They study English like it's a dead language, if that's possible. And so they do all this sort of grammatical jigsaw puzzles and stuff. This was then. It's not that bad now. But the vast majority of people did not speak English at all. And the vast majority of people, because of where I lived, had never seen a foreigner before in person. So it's like every time you left the apartment and go out, people would freak out. People would see you on the street and, be like genuinely surprised. And I mean, usually in a good way, and people were sort of kind and approachable. Occasionally people made it clear that they didn't want you around. But for the most part, it was very positive. But it was you did feel like this is not we're not in Kansas anymore. Not that I'd been to Kansas either.
But also as well, in 2012, you actually won the SIBA Book Award for your book, Darwin Arkwright. And I was wondering if you can actually tell us a bit more about this prestigious award. And of course, for the viewers that haven't actually had the opportunity to read this phenomenal book, could you tell us a bit more about it? And of course, where can we actually buy it today?
Good question. So the Darwin Arkwright series was I had been writing mostly adult thrillers when I started publishing. I also did some sort of epic fantasy kind of stuff, But the Darwin Arkwright series was a middle grade, it's sort of Harry Potter-esque, it's a bit it's aimed at a slightly younger reader. And the premise of the story, it's about an English kid who moves to Atlanta, which is where I was living at the time. And he doesn't know anybody there. You can hear a pattern here, right, in my stories, where he's sort of by himself. And one day he's in this mall and he sees a bird thing, but it's not a bird, and he follows it, and it goes into this little shop that sells mirrors, and it goes inside the mirror. So he can sort of look at himself in the mirror and see this thing looking back at him. And this is the start of this story. It's sort of portal fiction, right? He gets one of these mirrors and takes it home and discovers that after sundown, it turns into a doorway into another world, which is, beautiful and strange and full of monsters that are trying to get out. And so it's the first of 3 books. Now, in terms of where you can buy them, they are still available in the US. And the first one is called Darwin Arkwright and the Peregrine Pact, because, nice, easy to remember name. But they have just been reissued in the UK under different names, called Monsters in the Mirror. And they're available as paperbacks. And the paperback's really beautiful. They got a really great visual artist, so the covers are fantastic, and all these illustrations inside that are really good as well. So the first one is called Monsters in the Mirror. The second one is called The Miraculous Mission, and the third one is called The Mirrors Shattered. But they're I mean, as with all things, you can find them on Amazon and so on. Yeah.
And I got to say as well, it definitely is a phenomenal series. I remember reading them actually years ago when I was just getting out of high school, man, and I really
Really?
enjoyed the read. Yeah,
You ain't,
we actually
huh?
read them back in my 12th, grade 12th year. They actually read the very first book with us. I got to
Wow.
admit, I always read ahead. I didn't like reading in class because then you read one chapter and you got to wait a day. I would just take the book home and read the whole book, and then I didn't have to pay attention in class. But it definitely is a phenomenal read.
That's very cool. Thank you. I assume that when I'm being interviewed, most of the time they haven't read anything. So
I always try my best to actually know kind of what I'm getting into, who I'm interviewing. I actually didn't put 2 and 2 together until I was doing the questions for this interview, and I saw the name of the book. I'm like, Darwin. I'm like, that book sounds familiar. So I went and read what it's about, and I'm like, I read that in high school.
wow, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the other thing about me that I have always sort of written in lots of different genres. I write for different age groups. And as I say, I'm mystery, thriller, fantasy, sci-fi, and stuff. So sometimes people who've read my stuff in one area don't even know that the other stuff exists. And in the old days, when everybody used to buy their books in physical bookstores, they literally wouldn't, because they'd be in one part of the store and they would be reading my fantasy or whatever, and they'd never go over to the mystery or thriller sections and find the other stuff that I was doing there as well. So, yeah.
And also as well, you are currently actually working alongside Tom DeLonge of Blink-182 and Angels and Airwaves. I was wondering if you can actually tell our listeners a bit more about that. And of course, how did yourself and Tom DeLonge originally get connected?
He was, I mean, I think he already had an idea for the Secret Machines project, and he was looking for somebody to partner with. He reached out to my agent, and I think initially he was just I think he was sort of making a lot of contacts, and my agent called me and said, do you want to be considered for this particular project? And generally speaking, I don't do sort of ghostwriting or that sort of co-writing. I'm tending to do my own stuff. But I had some things on submission that had been sitting around for a while, and so I didn't have like a project on the front burner. And I was like, well, throw my hat in the ring, and I'm sure he's looking at lots of people. And if he likes my stuff, then we take it from there. So I guess she sent him some of my books, and he liked them, and she said, do you want? He wants to talk to you and start sort of fleshing out what the concept is. So it was basically like an interview. So we had a conversation on the phone, and it was several conversations, and he was like, and then he got back to me and he's like, yeah, I definitely want you to do this. And I was still a little cautious initially, because I was like, I knew Tom as a musician. But I'm like, I don't know anything about, what he's going to be as a co-writer or anything like that. And he said, well, I really want you to do it. How can I, sort of sweeten the pot? And I'm like, well, I just finished this other sort of sci-fi, the first of a new sci-fi series called Cathedrals of Glass. Actually, it wasn't called that at the time, but that's what it became. And I was like, do you want to take a look at that as well? And he's like, yeah, sure, send it. So I sent it to him, and he's like, and then he calls me back and he's like, yeah, this is awesome. I want 3 of those. And I was like, okay, you want 3 of those and 3, and at the same time, like literally within about 2 weeks, the other book that I'd had on submission, which is called Steeplejack, also landed at Tor, and they also wanted 3 books. So within the space of about 3 weeks, I went from having nothing under contract to having 9 books under contract. Which was sort of terrifying, to be honest. And so then I started working with Tom, and the first step really, we started sort of brainstorming right away, and he would send me things, and we would talk a lot on the phone. And then he flew me out to California. We spent like a long weekend just sort of hashing out what these things were going to be and how they were going to work, because initially, when he first presented me with the idea, and he said, it has a sort of X-Files-y sort of, UFO phenomenon kind of subject matter. And I was like, well, when do you see this story set? And he's like, everywhere and in all periods. And I was like, dude, what? And he's like, yeah, it's got to be a global story that spans history. And I'm like, I don't know how to tell that. I literally, because, if it was going to be one book on this period and then one book on this period, he's like, no. It's got to be on everything all at once. And I'm like, so the big issue was like, okay, how do we figure out a way to tell this huge story in ways that feels coherent and unified, but which is sort of touching on all these other points of history and geography and stuff. In different cultures and so on. So that was the first big challenge. And I think, once we figured out we're going to use we're going to use 4 core characters who are each going to have their own storyline. And we're also going to shoot the whole thing through with these little interludes, these moments from history, from other places and so on. And that all of this stuff would gradually start to weave together, but initially it would be quite disorienting for the reader. But if they stick with it, then those stories would start to come together. And I think, the real breakthrough was when I thought, the other thing that would be really cool is that in the final sort of quarter of the book, because I knew this was going to be a big book, I was like, let's make it so that the chapters get shorter and shorter and shorter as all these people, all their stories start to sort of intersect and all come together in the same place in the same time, as much as that is possible, so that it feels like everything's coming to a point. So it's not like a bunch of different stories, it's one story being told from lots of different perspectives. So that was how it worked.
And if you don't mind me asking, were you surprised at his like co-writing skills? Because, like you said, you're always like a solo author. You do books yourself, so you were obviously a little skeptical getting into this. Were you surprised at his work ethic right at the beginning?
I wasn't. I mean, I would. Skeptical's maybe the wrong word. I think the way that Tom framed it right from the start was basically it's like I'm going to throw a bunch of ideas at you, and I'm going to sort of direct you in terms of research and stuff that I want you to look at, and things that I want you to watch or listen to, whatever. Um, and I want you to sort of run by, you know, build an outline, build, and that we can sort of talk about as we go. But when it comes to the actual sentences, that's on you. And I was like, perfect, because I that is the way that I would prefer to work. So when it came to actually drafting stuff, I would write this stuff pretty much by myself, knowing that he knew where each section was going and what we were doing, and then I would send it to him, and he would send me notes and say, "Well, I love this. This could use a tweak." Blah blah blah. And so we would build the stories that way, and he's very upfront about that. You know that we're co-authors, but our jobs are very very different. That he's sort of, you know, he comes up with the main idea, and is sort of directing me to the things that he wants me to do. But in terms of writing character and plot and stuff like that, that's on me. That's my job.
And also, before we move off the topic of Tom DeLonge and whatnot, obviously, as we already know, the music industry got turned literally up by storm with Tom DeLonge rejoining the group. And I do know that you actually put a post up, I believe it was a day or so before the news broke. If you don't mind me asking, when and how did you actually find out the news? Because me personally, as a fan, I knew that something was going on when he changed his Instagram bio. I was like, yo, like I said, he's an author like yourself, right?
Yeah.
I make music. It's all about context. Once I saw that, I was like, oh, something's going on.
When did he do that?
I think that when he changed his Instagram bio was like August, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have been sitting on this since March. So he told me I have a little YouTube channel where I mostly talk about Japanese rock music, if you can believe that. And I interviewed him on my little channel, and we just sort of talked about, you know, various things. And as soon as we had finished recording, he was like, "Okay, some stuff I got to tell you." And they were in the studio then, you know, and the tour was already planned. And so and because part of Tom's personality is that he dreams really big, and sometimes when we plan things, you know, we sort of driven by his enthusiasm and his ambition. I don't mean ambition in terms of making money or something like that. I mean creative ambition, right? The desire to produce big things. And sometimes, you know, life gets in the way or logistics get in the way. And one of the things he said to me many times is, you know, I know it sounds crazy when we talk about this stuff and what we're going to do, and often it winds up taking a lot longer than I think it's going to take, but we will get there, you know. And so, you know, with the case in this case, this was one of those things where I was like, because I was monitoring social media from March onwards, and I'm like, how does nobody know about this? You know, how can nobody tell that Mark and Travis and Tom are in the studio together? How has nobody noticed? You know, so I kept waiting for the news to break, and when it didn't break, I thought, well, maybe he spoke too soon. Maybe what he was telling me hadn't really sort of actually come together in the ways that he thought it had. And maybe this is not really going to happen. But he kept, you know, we stayed in touch over the summer and stuff, and talking about other things and other projects. And occasionally I would be like, "Is this still happening? Are you still doing this?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, yeah. Just wait, you know." And I'm like, "I'm saying nothing to anybody." Um, and and then yeah, so I was relieved when it was sort of announced, because I felt like I'd been carrying it around for 7 months, you know, which is a long time to keep that kind of secret. You know?
I gotta say, I definitely agree with the secret side of things, man. Like, I don't know, like I said, I had a feeling something was going on. Like, I'm a fan, but I also observe situations. A lot of people were like, "No, it's bull crap." I'm like, "No, they're doing something." Like, you know what I mean? Because I even knew Angels and Airwaves had a tour, and then it got canceled, which is understandable due to COVID, but it never got
Yeah,
rescheduled. It's like, why wouldn't it get rescheduled? You're doing other
yeah,
things.
yeah. I mean, Tom, there's a lot of stuff in the works, a lot of stuff, and some of it involves me, beyond the Secret Machines and Cathedrals of Glass series. Um, but yeah, and I was talking to him about it recently about some of the other things that we're planning, and I'm like, when is this going to happen? Because you're going to be on the road a lot. And he's like, well, yeah, a couple of years, but it will be a couple of months on, couple of months off. We will. He is very heavily scheduled, and there'll be other things happening in between. Yeah.
And also, when you actually brought up at the beginning of the interview about your most recent book titled Burning Shakespeare that actually released March 29th of this year of 2022, I was wondering if we can just touch base on that really, really quickly, because I know you mentioned it earlier on, but for the viewers that are just now tapping in and didn't get an opportunity to hear a little bit more about this phenomenal book, could you tell us a bit more about this 20-year just in the works book? And of course, like, is it actually available on Amazon or your official website to actually purchase?
Yeah, everything, all my stuff is available on Amazon, and if you go to my website, which is ajhartley.net, you'll find all the stuff, all my books, with sort of links to where you can get them according to how you like to buy books, whether you prefer ebooks or physical books or whatever, audiobooks. And so, Burning Shakespeare. So the premise of the story is a guy sells his soul to the devil so that he can go back in time and wipe Shakespeare from history because he hates it so much. And it's a sort of comic, time travel-y thing. People have compared it to Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, something like Good Omens, or those kind of stories. Um, and as you already said, I'm a Shakespeare professor, and in some ways that's it's a plus in some ways, but it's also a minus. It's a plus because I know more than anybody needs to know about Shakespeare. Um, it's a minus for that same reason, right? That one of the reasons it took me so long to get to a point where I was happy with the book was because I had to keep taking out my lecture notes. I kept having to sort of say, this is a story about characters doing stuff. It's not an opportunity for you to tell people about why you think Shakespeare is cool. And you know, the way the story works is that the devil is a devil is orchestrating this guy's attempt to get Shakespeare out of history, and an angel is doing the opposite. An angel assembles a team of recently dead humans to stop the devil from doing what they're doing, right? And so, but for me, the breakthrough was sort of was wrestling with the fact that most of those ordinary people didn't actually care about Shakespeare and were not convinced that saving Shakespeare so that he survives into the present was actually a good thing, and that the angel has to basically make the deal with them that you know what you're really doing, if you're successful, then you get your life back. And that then immediately it raises the stakes for them. It gives them something very personal to shoot for. And it means that, the story is then about people. It's not just about Shakespeare. And I think, the key to the story was taking them seriously and saying, they might have really good reasons. Whatever I think about Shakespeare, they might have really good reasons to not want to have anything to do with Shakespeare. And there's both comic potential in there, but there's also some seriousness. Most of my books are at some point going to wrestle with ideas of some sort. So that's all part of that.
And I got to say as well, just hearing the story of that, or just the story and the plot of that book, I got to add that to my next reading list. It definitely sounds like it's a very interesting read that I probably will not be able to put down.
I hope not. I think it's a fun read. I think it does some. Somebody said to me, if you love Shakespeare, this is a great book for you. If you hate Shakespeare, this is a great book for you. So, win-win.
I was just gonna say that either way, a win-win, especially, you know. But hopefully they like Shakespeare. But if you don't, like, at least you might potentially get to see him die. Who knows?
No spoilers.
But also, I have to ask because obviously you said you got a lot of stuff currently in the works right now, and I know some things obviously you can't speak about, but some you might be able to. And every interview I do, I always like asking the individual, "What is next? Like, is there anything I
Mm.
happen to miss? Anything else you do still want to talk about or promote? You definitely have the floor."
My next book is called Hideki Smith, and it's a technically a young adult adventure set in North Carolina, which is where I live, but it involves a lot of Japanese folklore and mythology. It's about a mixed race Japanese kid, like my son, who develops a kind of ancestral abilities because suddenly there are these sort of strange creatures from Japanese mythology popping out in the mountains of North Carolina, and nobody knows what the hell's going on, and he has to fight them. And it's an adventure story. It's also a story about him sort of wrestling with issues of his own identity and where he comes from and where he doesn't come from, right? And I don't know when the book will be out. I would say sometime, hopefully early next year in the US. It'll come out from Falstaff Books. In the UK, I think it'll come out a little bit later from UClan, who also did my Coldbath Street, and they did the UK versions of the Monsters in the Mirror books as well. So, yeah.
And also, quickly before we part ways, if you can, I was wondering if you can actually like let our viewers know your social media handles. That way, they can look further into you, check out more of your history as an author and a professor, and of course, just follow you and stay updated on everything you currently got going on.
Yeah, so as I said, my website is ajhartley.net. That in some ways is the most important one, and that'll give you the connections. I'm also on I'm on Facebook. There's an author page on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter as I never remember. I hate Twitter. Or is it author AJ Hartley? Something like that. I'm on Instagram as well. Probably the same. See, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about publicity and marketing, as you can tell. So I'm very bad at it. But I'm relatively easy to find. AJ Hartley, you'll find me.
Hey, you know what? You do what you do best, and that is being an author. You know what I mean? You just you let your team do the marketing for you, man. I don't blame you.
A team. I wish I had a team.
But I got to say, first and foremost, AJ, just thank you so much for your time here this evening and just talking about some of your history within being an author and of course some of your newest projects. And I got to say thank you as well for years of amazing reads as well that so many individuals have the opportunity to enjoy. And I'm definitely looking forward to more years of books coming from you, man. So thank you so much, AJ, for your time.
I really appreciate it. Thanks very much for having me on.
You are most certainly welcome. Have yourself a phenomenal night.
Cheers. Good night.
Good night.